To the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. This week we were discussing Game of Thrones with a friend, and our friend asked the question, why do people like the show so much? And I could substitute the word love in many instances. People are devoted to the show Game of Thrones. And our friend was contending that it's such a downer that people die, and it's very sad. And I should state right now that there may be some spoilers here up to the first episode of season 8, so beware. But that question triggered us thinking and talking about what the attraction is for Game of Thrones. And Don and I have kind of reached the conclusion that it has to do with the show having a very fourish atmosphere, and people perhaps longing in this time, this era, for a greater degree of authenticity and just real life. So with me, as I said, is Don, representing the Enneagram expertise aspect.
Yeah, and we're really a team here, and Cindy has quite a bit of insight into the Enneagram. She's only been studying it a little less time than I have, maybe about 5 years less. I'm probably close to 20 years, and having been around this stuff. And once you get a handle on the Enneagram, you find it so incredibly useful in understanding people and things and relationships. And it's to the point where it's pretty hard not to look at any major show without thinking about what Enneagram type they are, just as a way of understanding the characters. So, of course, we do that with Game of Thrones. And then you take a step back and you think about the appeal of the show. And what Cindy was just describing was the foorishness of the show and how that relates to authenticity. It may not be obvious, but so I'll state it a little bit more explicitly. Right now we're living in an age of deception in which people may not know it, but their heart's cry deep inside is for something to be real. They know that they're surrounded by lies and they want reality. And so what we're going to call the foorishness of this show really appeals to that. A heart cry of the four is, I've got to be me, kind of the old Frank Sinatra line or whatever. And I'm not saying he's four, but the whole thing about authenticity is so very much a part of the whole four Enneagram point. So a show can have a flavor as far as the Enneagram goes. And then, of course, that doesn't mean that all the characters in the show are going to have that Enneagram type. It means that there are that's the lens through which the show kind of operates. And we'll see definitely other Enneagram types in the show, and we'll go through those one by one. We'll try to keep it kind of brief because there's so many characters. And one of the things that we want to make sure people understand is that we're not trying to pigeonhole people. We're trying to give a frame of reference in which certain types are more likely than others. And we think that that's the best way to go about understanding the Enneagram and Enneagram typing, is to do it kind of by process of elimination and process of most likely. And that's a good way to deal with finding your own type and finding types of family members as well. So if you want to introduce us, Cindy, into the first of our characters.
The first character that we wanted to mention is Jon Snow. And I know what type Don thinks he is. At first, when I was starting to consider this four aspect of the show, I was thinking that Jon Snow might be a 4. He in this image, he has what I would think of as a 4 look, but then again, a lot of the characters do. So one of the representations of 4 that I think about is longing, and his look is kind of a longing look. It's like he's searching for something, he wants something, but I'm very aware that, and I've done some quick searches through Twitter and online, there aren't many. I didn't find anybody else who thinks that Jon Snow is a 4. So I'll let Dawn. I'll yield to Dawn, and to the wisdom of most of the people who study the Enneagram and tweet about it.
Yeah, I view Jon Snow as a 9, and the reason why is he has a hard time finding himself, and I mean that's not the only reason, but one of the things about the evolution of this character is like he doesn't know who he is or what he stands for or what his purpose is, and at times defers to other people, and then at times stands alone by himself, and it's just he's kind of all over the place in a way that is a typical 9 script. And there's also a softness, a malleability about him that you actually see in this photo. Is that there's a not a preciseness. There's not a hard edge. It's even though he takes difficult stands and often does a very difficult thing and is often misunderstood for it. There's always the desire not to have to be in that position. So this is a typical 9 paradox as I see it.
Our next character for consideration is Daenerys, who I think is a lot of people's favorite. I've heard a lot of women say that she's their favorite character. And I am putting forth Daenerys as a 6. And I think she presses herself to overcome her fears in various circumstances, and she's cagey. She's cautious. She doesn't commit to things quickly, at least if it's going to cost her something. And so, Don, I don't think you agree with me on Daenerys.
No, I see her as an 8, and she's kind of a soft 8, but there is a type of 8 that is kind of an atypical 8, and being female and small. And I think that I see Daenerys in that mold. She does have leadership ability. It's somewhat understated. She's coming into her own. She doesn't want to be her father, who was widely recognized as being tyrannical, but she knows she has a leadership role to play, and she's trying to find herself in it. But it's not the way that a 6 would do it by forming a team. She's basically solo. She's got into this situation with being in a marriage that was very difficult, and then coming out and emerging to be the power after her husband died and leading the whole tribe, the whole group. And it's her leadership and her ability to be at one with these dragons is just cries out 8 to me. She just resonates with the dragon's very 8-like power. There's hardly anything more visceral and a tying to the gut than the dragon and her connection to them. So that to me speaks a will type, and that speaks 8. It's not in a 6-ish way through forming a team. It's I see her as an 8.
This brings us to Cersei, whom many people who have tweeted about Enneagram types of Game of Thrones believe is an 8. I am not going to argue strongly against that, but there is kind of a 6 vibe about her. She kind of steps back a couple of steps and works people, plays people, to me, a little bit more than an 8 would. 8s, to me, often seem to be more direct.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I tend to see her as more 6-ish than 8-ish, even though I know the whole thing about loyalty for your kids, and that's Cersei's big, actually strong point, is how she stands by her children, and the whole thing about the family being the closest. That's very 6-ish. I mean, I'm sorry, very 8-ish, but it can be 6-ish too. And it's the the whole mental aspect of the game she plays. It's much more mental than Daenerys, for example. And so I do tend to see Cersei kind of in a six-ish manner.
Next, we have Bran, and I'm proposing that Bran is a 5. Now, he may have a very strong 4 wing, but there's so much mystery about him.
Yeah, I agree with you, although I'm open to considering him as being a straight 4, so mystical. You don't really, I don't think, see a lot of evidence that he's actually using a reasoning ability. It's more of a supernatural thing going on there. But I could be persuaded that he's a head type. The relationship with the older person who is the tree teaching him how to be a tree. I don't know how to put all this stuff into exactly the right words. I wouldn't consider myself a supreme Game of Thrones avatar. But anyway, somewhere in the 4-5 area, and perhaps even a straight 4.
Well, he has a very powerful mind, which is why I think I might lean toward 5. But our next character is Jorah, and Jorah's one of my favorites, and I had not really considered closely his Enneagram type. I'm a 2, and there are some people who have floated the possibility that Jorah may be a 2.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I confess that I can't help but see that character and think about the character he plays as the Irish detective. I forget the name. Maybe it's Jack Taylor, something like that. Anyway, so that's kind of an alcohol problem, Irish guy. And to me, that kind of blends together. And artists, actors, tend to play the similar types. So that kind of addictive behavior kind of a type where he's very much in this as Jorah, he's very much a total role of being a facilitator for Daenerys. He's a servant of Daenerys. He's basically, his whole fate is tied to her. So that's a 2 script right there. So I have no trouble agreeing that he's a 2. I'm just not sure how much that is the role that he's playing and how much the actor is. Now, maybe the actor's a 9, and 9 would also potentially work as a type for him, except that he's functionally, he's very much a 2.
Yeah, he is functionally. There is a longing for Daenerys, a longing for something that he knows that he won't have, which might indicate that he's a 4, but a 2 has the capability of moving toward 4 via the arrows. So I'm not stating one or the other conclusively, as you suggested that it's not really fair to do that. Because of course we can't give a typing interview to these characters, which would certainly be an interesting adventure. Our next character is Sansa Stark, and I don't think I will even. I mean, I could see her as a 6. I could see her as a 4 with a strong 3 wing, a 3 with a strong 4 wing. I don't think I'll commit with regarding Sansa's type at all.
I tend toward 6 with her. There's just something about her that I see as being a mental type, which is a little less engaging than a heart type, for instance. I don't know why, but she's just not as easily connecting to other people as perhaps a 3 or even a 4 would. You see her kind of doing things behind the scenes, trying to have an alternate scenario going on. I'm thinking in terms of her interaction with Jon Snow. I think if you think of that in terms of a 9-6 dynamic, their relationship, it kind of sheds some light on it that Jon would regress when he went in the direction of her, and being the point of disintegration for a 9 being 6. And if Sansa was to go more to 9, she'd be operating more in her benevolent and strong security point. So that's what she does when she tends to assume a responsibility role for the crowd, kind of move into emerging 9 mode. So I see her, and the 6 is useful to me for. I'm not 100% sold on it either. And again, this is some of the confusion of the actor versus the part that you have there. And I should make it clear that neither one of us have read the books, so we're operating solely on the basis of the films.
I agree with you that she does hold herself aloof. She has the ability to remain detached from, like, for instance, Tyrion, to whom she was married, and from Littlefinger, who tried unsuccessfully to seduce her in a few different scenes. So yeah, I agree. She probably is not a heart type. I don't think a heart type would be able to be quite that resistant to people who were courting her. Next, we have the character who is probably the favorite of many people, and as our friend stated, who wondered why people like the show, sometimes the only comic relief is Tyrion. So I'm seeing Tyrion not only for that reason, but because he loves to drink. He loves to party. He's very social. I am going to make a call that Tyrion may be a 7.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And he is very fun and gets put in difficult circumstances at times, and has sort of a tragic pull in his life. And again, that's sort of the foolishness of the show, that there is much tragedy in all of the characters. But Tyrion, in a typical 7 fashion, has the ability to move beyond that and to find something optimistic to which to build. He doesn't ever really go very deep in despair. Even when he loses the person he's betrayed by the person who he considers probably the love of his life, he bounces back eventually, and he comes up against opposition with his father. And if you haven't seen the show, I'm not going to say too much about that, but he's always forward-looking, and that's a typical 7 characteristic.
Yes, and the show can have a 4 vibe, not only because there are a lot of 4s, but because there are characters who can move toward 4. Next, we have Jaime Lannister, and talk about tragic. Although he hasn't suffered the kind of losses that some of the other characters have, he's been beaten down and has managed to come back. And as the show has progressed, as the seasons have passed, he seems to me to be moving from. It seems to me that his difficulties are refining him and making him a better person. It's very difficult for me I kind of want to say 7, since he's Tyrion's brother. That is a possibility. Sometimes Enneagram types tend to reappear in different members of the same family. I'm not going to commit to a type for Jaime, though.
Yeah, I'm thinking that he might be, that you might be surprised to say that 1, because ethically, you might say there's reasons that he wouldn't be a 1. But that's one of the things that we have to be careful about, is putting our own value judgments on a type. And of course, 1 considers themselves ethical. The other possibility is 2, because he's very in love with his sister. He is also very supportive of her. He has a two-ish role towards Cersei in the same kind of a way that Jorah has to Daenerys. So I'm thinking one wing two or two wing ones are both possibilities for him. When I look at the actor, I kind of see a little bit of one-ishness. So I do confess that I kind of go by a look there. I'm not sure about that, though. I wouldn't rule out 9. I wouldn't necessarily rule out even 6. So he's not a major character and is a little bit hard to determine.
Next, we have another extremely tragic character. I would consider him possibly one of the most tragic characters. He went through extreme personal suffering and is also someone who has been refined through suffering and come out as a better person. And as the seasons pass, he's just has more and more integrity. And so Theon Greyjoy, I'm going to consider him a 4. He definitely has a 4 look, and as you stated, that might be the actor who's a 4, not the character. But the way he has, and probably with a strong 5 wing, he has this underlying determination that has borne him through extreme suffering.
See what you're looking at there. Don't think that's the character. I think that's more the actor, and I'm going to say that the character Theon is almost certainly a 2, because I'm thinking of a Theon in the cage and forgetting his own identity and being only what the person who has him imprisoned wants him to be. And that's such a 2 script. And then the way he defers to his sister, not taking on any kind of a leadership role himself, but giving that to his sister, I see that as being pretty 2-ish. So I'm going to say that that's the strongest possibility for me on Theon.
Next, we have the sister, Yara, to whom you were referring. And I don't have a great affinity for this character. She's not one of my favorites. I'm just going to say 8. She gets mad at people. She overpowers people. She doesn't necessarily listen to people, but at the same time, she tries to fight for the underdog. And of anybody in the show, I would be most confident about calling her an 8.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I would see necessarily an 8 in her as I do in Daenerys. I'm thinking that 8s often have more of a warmth about them, even when they're coming off as a bully. There's just something a little bit more magnetic. There's a coldness about her that to me looks more 1-ish, and I'm thinking maybe 9 wing 1 or 1 wing 9. I wouldn't rule out 6 either. And I'm just, she doesn't seem to be forming a team, though, so that would kind of argue against 6. She's not really building bridges, as we see in some of the other characters that have 6 tendencies or 6 possibilities. Just it's not really resonating with me for her.
Okay, I stand corrected.
No, you're free to keep that.
Next, we have another tragic figure, Stannis Baratheon. And I don't want to be too much of a spoiler in saying why he's such a tragic character. And I don't think I'll even float out an Enneagram type. I was so disappointed in this character's behavior that I didn't really let myself make an emotional connection with him. So I don't have a strong opinion about his Enneagram type.
And I'm thinking that he'd be a 5. I didn't express that before, but the way he tries, he's disconnected from his heart. And that's a common problem with fives. And he does some things that are definitely, in retrospect, he probably wishes he didn't do, that have to do with loyalties that he betrayed and that you wouldn't really expect. So, yeah, he's a tragic character, and he gets sucked into a script, you could almost say, bewitched, to actually do stuff that would be against his better judgment. He is in a position of leading a large group of people, is looked to as a leader. That's not a common five role, so I'd say maybe a six-wing five or a five-wing six. And I wouldn't rule out 9 or 1 either. But he's in his head a lot, so I'm going to go with a six-wing five.
Next we have Littlefinger, the man who most people love to hate. I just because of he's a scoundrel, he's so self-serving, and he's deceptive. I'm going to say 3.
So, I see him as that's a possibility, but he doesn't have that charm or a warmth, a way of making a connection with people that a 3 would typically have. A 3 is often less intentionally deceptive and more believing their own press release, so to speak. I don't see Littlefinger that way. I see him as, and I confess, I go a lot by the look. Just sort of, he has that one-ish, every hair in place kind of a look. And people are surprised when they find one-ish criminal minds, but that's actually fairly common because he has an ethos that works for him. It advances him, and that's his own personal justification for being the way he is. He's found ways to maneuver in power and be in a very conniving way. And I think he's a kind of a Hillary Clinton-ish one, to put it in a political sense. So I do kind of see him as a twisted one.
That does make a certain degree of sense. Our next character is Samwell, and he seems very much like a 2 to me. He uses his mind a lot, and he's known for being studying, being very deep into book learning, but his connection to other characters is so deep, and his commitment is so strong that I'm going to say 2 for Samwell.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is he a heart type or is he a head type? And this is a situation where you'd really want to do a typing interview to find out more about the character. And first he had a loyalty to the watch, and then a loyalty to a woman, and then a loyalty to the to the Jon Snow character. That was throughout all of that. So a 2 script does seem very likely for him. The head part of it, I'm not sure either, and that he could be a 5 with a strong 6-wing, and the loyalty being a big part of who he is, or a 6 with a 5-wing, the love of learning. Kind of undetermined. I wouldn't rule out 9 either. That's a very strong possibility as well. He doesn't have, if he's a mental type, I don't see 7 in him so much, even though he's overweight, and that's a kind of a 7 stereotype. He just doesn't have that jovial quickness that a 7 often has. So I probably rule out 7. But, that somewhere in the 2, 5, 6 area, I think is possible.
I suppose it's also possible that he could be a 4, because that 4 is really the type that can hold together the connection with 2 as an arrow and the connection with 5 as a wing. So perhaps that makes sense for some.
Yeah, I agree. And there is often a weight thing about 4s too. So it's that's a good point. That's a good possibility.
And next we have Arya. A lot of people seem to think she's an 8, which does make a lot of sense. However, her body type, and this is the actor, again, it's difficult because a lot of times body type weighs heavily for me if I'm looking at someone to see what their Enneagram type may be. And they don't necessarily have the body type of their character. So 8, obviously a consideration. The revenge, though, is so strong, and anger is so much a part of her nature that I'm just going to float out the possibility that she might be a 1.
Yeah, I'm not sure about her. I think 1 is a possibility. 8's a possibility. Maybe also 6. We do see her alone a lot in terms of, in the beginning, she is with one other person who's kind of her mentor. I mean, she's really young in the beginning, too, so she needs someone to school her. She's not a person that is shy at all from getting physical and wanting to fight. That was a part of her identity from the very beginning, her sword and needle and her training by her father. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that she's not a head or a heart type, most likely a will type. So that could be 1, could be 9, 8 is also a possibility. So I think we just put her in the gut triad. That's somewhere in there. And the whole justice can get mixed with revenge. They're not so distinct that we would say, well, if she's about justice and that makes her an 8, then she can't be about revenge, which would make her 1. I think it's all in the same milieu, so I wouldn't want to try to distinguish between the types based on that alone. I do hear you what you're saying about body type. I think she has more of a body type of a typical 1 than she does of an 8. 9s can be all over the map as far as body type goes. So nothing real conclusive there except for probably gut type.
Yeah, I don't think 6 works because at all. And you ruled that out too, but she's walked away from a few people who were in need, who she might have felt loyalty to. So yeah, I rule out the 6. Here we have Brienne, and I noticed online that quite a few people believe that she's a 1, and I don't think I can argue against that. I think there's a certain tragedy about her because she's in love with Jaime Lannister. So you might have a little shadow of 4 there, but 4 and 1 are connected by an arrow. So I don't have a strong opinion, but probably somewhere around between 4, 1.
Yeah, of course, the fact that she's very physical, but in a way similar to Arya, is arguing that she's probably a 1 and not a 4. And so I think I tend to agree with that a little bit more, that the connection to 4 would be through that arrow rather than as being a true center or type. And but I do see a lot of loyalty there in terms of pledging to be defending Sansa Stark, and that's a big part of who she is. So I see a 6 script there too. I wouldn't rule out a 1 ethical standard of loyalty as well. So both of those could play into loyalty. Whenever you see 6, it's easy to say, well, that's the loyal type. Well, loyalty can manifest in other types as well. So don't necessarily see her as being a team-forming type of a 6 person, but there are 6s that don't form teams. It's kind of a rarity. Well, I saw one once, and now in an Enneagram interviews that was most interesting. So I do tend to generally think of 6 as pack animals, and she's not, but that's not true of all 6s 100%. But I'm going to go with 1.
Here we have Melisandre, and she's a very interesting character. I happen to be a Christian, and the early introductions of Melisandre, because she clearly was practicing witchcraft, were kind of off-putting for me. But then she's another character who, through the seasons, has been refined to a certain extent. I think she's still practicing what I would consider to be a form of witchcraft. But there's a more of a moral orientation, more of a less selfish, and I'd say she has become somewhat more objective to be able to make better decisions. Her Enneagram type, because of the mysticism, to me says somewhere around the 4-5 area. I guess if I had to just shoot from the hip, I would say 5-wing 4.
Yeah, you might be right about that. I wasn't thinking that initially, but then if you know the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think it's Circe that is the seductress 5, not the sirens, but the one who's basically bewitches the Ulysses character with witchcraft. She tends to be considered a 5. So that's a possibility there. And then you do see more of a head operating through her and less of a heart than a typical heart type. I was going to say 2, because she kind of had a 2-ish seductive kind of a way with Stannis. And although looking back on it now, there's really more of a mental aspect of it, of that relationship, than there was anything that was physical. So I would tend to agree with you there that 5 is a very strong possibility. And I want to just add the little thing that as far as witchcraft goes, as Christians, the objection we have to that is not that it's another religion and it's a bad religion per se. What's going on there is that the whole idea of witchcraft is bending the will of somebody else to your purposes, and that's basically something that we believe is contrary to free humanity and the freedom of the will that Christianity gives. So, and what we believe is God's divine order. So that's the whole point there. But she seems to be less of an evil seductress than she was in the beginning.
Well, yes, and I tend to shy away a little from people who regularly have human sacrifice rituals. So that's an aspect of her. Here we have Hodor, and it's hard for me even to talk about him. There was so much heartbreak, and I think one of the most really devastating scenes in the whole series, because we always feel sad for people who are disabled, and coming to a place of learning that he was disabled because he made a sacrifice, it's extremely moving. And there's also something beautiful about it in that he willfully sacrificed himself in a way that it's early in season 8. We don't know what the outcome's going to be, but he seems to have played a key role in helping if I can say it, in helping the living overcome the dead. And for that reason, because he was such a servant, so committed to Bran, I'm going to say 2.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I'm actually thinking of her as being kind of archetypical of the whole show, the whole Game of Thrones. He's kind of the character in many ways that underlies all of the other characters in a sort of archetypical sense, because he's holding back the evil. He's holding back the dead from the land of the living. That's the holding the door. That's what that's all about. And that's what the show is about. That's the whole theme of the show, is trying to stand against evil. And as we said in the beginning, in kind of a flourish way. So I do see that he's acting in the role of a servant, but there's that 2-4 connection. So it's a little hard to peg which is his type. He seems to have a heart connection, and he is disabled. So you can't really see a standard imprint of what his mental ability is or whatever. So I'm going to go with 4, though, because there is that kind of a tragic romantic aspect of his character, and that's the whole 4 script.
Next, we have what I would consider to be a quintessential 6 in Grey Worm. The soldier, completely loyal, doesn't even really question orders that much. He's there to do a job, be a part of a team, and again, quintessential 6.
Yeah, I see it very much in the same way. And of course, he's a leader of the army, picked out as such by Daenerys, that has that role, has the respect of his peers. And I believe that he kind of stays in that role as being a spokesperson for the army people in a conflict that's brought about by some decisions that Daenerys makes. And he does a good job of helping Daenerys navigate some difficult waters and some power struggles by keeping the army on her side and not revolting. Not sure if my memory of all of that part is completely accurate, but I do see him very much as a 6.
And the last character that we are considering is this scoundrel who I am going to say might be a 3, just a low 3, just because of his treachery, his deceit. He is successful in putting other people down and enjoys that very, very much.
Yeah, that might be Ramsay Bolton might be a downside 3. It's hard to know, because one of the things about the Enneagram is that in their disintegration or in their downsides, all the types tend to look similar, but that's the way humanity is. And in their altruistic side, as they become more their ideal, all the types tend to look the same. So in a very low point character, it's hard to tell the types apart. And that's what we have here with this character. Yeah, Ramsay Bolton. So it's kind of symptomatic of the show in general. We do see downsides of a lot of things, kind of the downside of the downside. He did enjoy power over others, and no type is really immune from that. We've talked about that with other characters. Not sure about a 3, because he doesn't really have that charm, and he doesn't really try to charm people. So, I'm saying maybe just more of a brute force. 8-wing 9 is also a possibility. I wouldn't rule out necessarily, maybe even a 1, maybe even a 6. But I'm going to say that most likely either 8 or 3. And those are very different types, but and they tend to get in clashes with each other sometimes. Just not enough information about that character to know for sure. One of the things that I've noticed in looking at the overall development of the show from the beginning on through the end is you see some trends in the families. You've got the Lannisters, you've got the Starks, and you've got some other family dynamics playing out. And one of the things is how they deal with power and the choices the children make based on what they've seen from their parents. And that's kind of an interesting study in its own right. But you see Tyrion, who purposely chose a path very different from his father. You also see that with Daenerys. We don't ever see her father, I don't believe, but in the series. But there's a lot of discussion about how she's not a tyrant like her father. So a lot of these characters tend to make decisions along those lines. With the Starks, it's kind of the same kind of thing in reverse. The Stark who dies in the beginning, Ned, is the father of the children that we see with later in the series. He was basically naive with regard to the ways of power, and that's what got him killed. He was a good person, but he needed to learn some hard lessons about the brutality of power, and that's what the children are in the process of learning. So I think we see the same kind of learning process kind of happening in reverse with the Starks, where they have to learn how to be cunning enough to survive and to maintain power, whereas we see some other people like Daenerys and Tyrion who are somewhat moving in the opposite direction. They know how to handle power, and they know how devious people can be, but they chose not to go to the most tyrannical or oppressive form.
Well, we hope that we have offered you a lot of food for thought. And to the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, thank you for joining us for this look into the possible Enneagram types of some Game of Thrones characters. We realize that we did not cover the full scope. Please feel free to leave comments requesting further analysis if you so desire. And if you have indeed liked this video, enjoyed watching it, listening to it, please click like and consider subscribing to our channel, Poli-Psych Podcast. Again, thank you for joining us, and until next time, take care.